Infrastructure has been a topic that we have covered throughout the very existence of the show, but certainly as we've gone through the calendar year 2021 here in season 7, infrastructure has kind of been something that we've been able to weave in through various episodes of this show. Now, we've had a number of wonderful, amazing guests on to talk about a variety of what we hope were interesting, informative topics, but certainly infrastructure has been at the fore, and that's the case here in our final episode of this season. I'm Bill Culhane, your host of The Big Bid Theory from our studios here in Austin, Texas. And I kind of mentioned it a moment ago. Thank you to our guest as we've gone through the 2021 calendar year. We trust that our show continues to be an important part of your news, of your information, of your enjoyment. Many of you know that recently we actually went to video here on the Big Bid Theory. Emily Feenstra, managing director from the American Society of Civil Engineers, came by to talk more about infrastructure with President Biden signing the infrastructure bill back on November 15th. Transformational legislation that we've been waiting for a long time. And also Stephen Hetzel, COO and co-founder at BidPrime, was kind enough to share his insights on industry, on what he expects from the bill, and how businesses, contractors, vendors can hopefully tap into much of what's about to come down the pike in the not too distant future when it comes to state, local, tribal, federal government agencies having the funds available to pursue a wide scope of projects. So again, more on that a little bit later in this episode, but now I want to bring in our producer, Rick Jennings. And Rick, I know there are so many things for which we can be proud of here in season 7 of the show as we've gone through the calendar year 2021. Many memorable moments, but what's going to stick out to you?
You're right. There's definitely been a lot of memorable moments this season. We've had a lot of great guests. I always love it when Dr. Rohde comes on to talk about what's going on. He's always one of our favorite people to have on. Also, of course, I love doing the crazy bids. We've had some really interesting ones this season, like shrimp sampling, stuff with horses, working remotely. I think my favorite had to be the alcohol sales in the library one that we did a little bit early on. That was an interesting one to come across for sure.
And I said it, Rick, infrastructure legislation, the infrastructure bill, something that you and I, of course, during production meetings, et cetera, as we've gone through the year, we've had a lot to talk about, a lot of research to be done. But that's big news as far as President Biden signing the bill.
It really is, and we're going to see it rolled out over quite a bit of time. And I bet you we're still going to hear from a lot of our guests in the future as well as to how this is all going to be applied and how our listeners who own their own businesses and such can participate in being part of that big sweeping change.
All right, Rick, you talked about crazy bids you can win a little bit earlier here in our conversation. And as I look through the glass, I'm not sure if those are tears in your eyes, tears of sadness that the season's coming to an end. I don't know. You don't have to tell us right now, but I would like, if you don't mind, for one final time here in season 7, what's the tease for the crazy bids coming up later in this episode?
Absolutely. So for this week, I picked out, I think, is a pretty good one. It's basically about doing laboratory testing, but not on something that you would expect at all. So stay tuned for this episode's Crazy Bid.
All right, Rick. Well, I say it all the time. We are excited to see what's coming up in that final Crazy Bids you can win here, the final one of season 7. In a moment, we are going to hear from our friend over in Reston, Virginia, right across the Potomac River from our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., Emily Feenstra from the American Society of Civil Engineers. And it'll be kind of a back-to-back scenario after you hear my conversation with Emily. Again, that was conducted via video. We've gone a little video here at the show. I will sit down with Stephen Hetzel from BidPrime. So stick around for those conversations. But first, here's a message from BidPrime.
The Big Bid Theory is brought to you in part by BidPrime.
Over 11 years in changing the bid services industry, BidPrime has become the solution for businesses serious about winning public sector business. From the premier technology in the industry to real-time bid notifications, supporting documents, and robust data tools, it's all backed by unmatched personalized customer support. BidPrime. Start your free zero-obligation trial today. BidPrime.com.
You obviously know ASCE, American Society of Civil Engineers, and if you were on the show, listening to the show a couple of months ago, you'll recall we visited with Emily Feenstra. Actually, we visited with Emily on the day that the Senate passed the bill. Well, Emily's the managing director for government relations and infrastructure initiatives at ASCE, and here she weighs in on a variety of topics related to their recently signed legislation.
I'm sure you've looked at the White House fact sheet and other documents. What are a few of the, I'm going to have to say this, use this word, the primary takeaways from the bill?
Sure. You gave me a nice lead in. I mean, it is enormous in scope. It's kind of behemoth. And so that's just, a simple point I always make at the top is it is very unique in how comprehensive it is when it comes to defining infrastructure. It used to be that we talked about infrastructure and it was roads and bridges, and that's certainly this of the bill. But when you look at other types of traditional physical infrastructure, such as the electric grid, ports and inland waterways, broadband, water systems, those are all included as well. And that's, some of the reason that the process was a little bit different. You had all these different committees of jurisdiction within Congress that had to come together to put together elements of the bill. But this is a recognition of a point we've made a long time at ASCE, that it's a system of systems. And if you have one weak link, for example, you have the ports, which have gotten a lot of attention. If the road connections, the rail connections to the ports are not in good shape, those ports are not going to function optimally. So I think that's one aspect of this bill, is recognizing that kind of holistic approach that we need.
Now, looking at some of the nuts and bolts of the bill itself, and Emily, you noted, and when I visited with you back in August, you mentioned I have visited in years past with Brian Palish from ASCE, and certainly roads, bridges, and construction are a big part of the conversation. But looking at before the projects even get underway, when it comes to consulting and planning and other prep work, is it fair to say that there's going to be a lot involved in those processes as well, before there's a shovel grab, before there's a truck that hits the road, before any paving or anything like that is done? Aren't there going to be other aspects involved as well?
Yes, it's a little bit of all of the above. So when you look, the total bill is 1.2 trillion, and it's a combination of formula funds and discretionary grants or new programs that we've never seen before. And so some of those formula funds, those are based on, a population in a state or the needs of a state. And those dollars might go out more quickly because each state or even local government has a list of capital projects, for example, that they've had on the books. You probably know some in your local community, this bridge that's been waiting for repairs for years, or this water treatment plant that needs an upgrade. Those things might already have the design completely done, and they just need that extra federal boost of dollars to get going. So those things you'll see quickly. And then others, yes, there's a lot of pre-design work. There's a lot of planning, doing things completely differently that you might see. And one example I might highlight is there's a huge focus on resilience in this infrastructure bill, and some new programs that we were really happy to see included that look at, pre-mitigation. So what are the ways we can set up our communities to be stronger when that disaster hits? How do we ensure that the stormwater goes where it needs to go and doesn't flood city streets over and over again? Would just be one example of that. So there's good policy and incentives so that cities start planning that way, and and there's funding to get some of those projects off the ground that are maybe low tech and low hanging fruit, but it'll keep us from spending those disaster dollars later.
Now, I'm sitting here in Texas, and so of course in Texas we know all about hurricanes, other weather disasters. And of course, we will all never forget the issue that we had with the power grid back in February of 2021. So resiliency is such an important part. You mentioned funding a moment ago, Emily. You were talking about grants, et cetera. Can you kind of talk about a little bit more about the mechanisms on how those federal dollars go from the nation's capital out to the various state and local entities that require projects to be completed?
Sure. And I probably need another week with you to go through all of it. But but just to give kind of some concrete examples of how some of this will work. And again, because it's such a big undertaking, there's a lot of questions still to be answered on how some of these programs will work. But going back to, for example, the U.S. Department of Transportation, they're going to direct the largest portion of the IIJA's investments. So in fact, they're going to direct more than half of the new funding under this new law. So you'll have a lot of formula funds that go out to state departments of transportation pretty quickly. And there's even mechanisms in place that, they have to do a certain number of things within 180 days. So believe me, those, they're calling them implementation teams at all those federal agencies have been thinking about this, but now they're really going kind of on overdrive to make sure they're ready to get those funds out to state departments of transportation. There's other new programs. Another one I'll just point to at USDOT called Reconnecting Communities, and you might have heard a little bit about it. But it's about correcting some of the past mistakes or past decisions. For example, building highways that divided communities, and oftentimes these were disadvantaged low-income minority communities. Looking at some of those and providing a pot of funding for cities and local governments to come to the table and say, we want to do something differently so that our community isn't divided in half. Those, I think, and a number of other programs are going to be directed in some ways, or at least the local governments will have eligibility to apply. That was a trend I saw across a lot of even existing grant programs, is locals or counties or metropolitan planning organizations can now apply for funds directly. And we know mayors and city councils have a really good understanding of the infrastructure needs in their communities. So, in general, we think that's a great thing.
Yeah, a good point there in going through how the funds are going to be handled, Emily. And it kind of compels me to segue to oversight of these various projects. And clearly there will be so many projects undertaken. We'll talk about maybe timeframes in a moment, but how is it broken down in terms of what the federal government is going to manage versus, I don't know if using the word delegate is the proper term, but the federal government overseeing projects versus the state and local entities, public sector agencies overseeing their own projects, managing their own projects?
It's definitely going to be a close partnership between all of those entities. And I think where you do see new grant programs, there's going to be pretty specific criteria in place, for example, to help give some posts to the state and locals who receive that money. So, for example, a big trend in a lot of the infrastructure sectors is more sophisticated asset management. So, know where your pipes are, know where your worst bridges are, have that data, not in a book somewhere, but in software, be updating that in real time. There's going to be a lot of levers that the federal government has to ensure those dollars are optimized, because the last thing we want is, to have this vote of confidence in upgrading and modernizing our infrastructure and then not have those dollars spent wisely. But in turn, you're going to see a lot of flexibility once those funds are dispersed for, I think, state and local governments. Again, they've got those capital improvement project lists. They've got plans in place. I think they're going to be able to, working within the confines of the grant programs, direct funding in a performance-based way. So it's not necessarily the federal government telling you, you need to build this bridge with 2 lanes in each direction, and it's got to move, it's going to be more about outcomes based. What are you doing to not only move people and goods, but do it in a way that protects or improves environmental health, for example, do it in an equitable way. There's kind of these guiding principles that the federal government has set up under this particular administration. And you see those themes woven throughout the federal agencies. And just a question you had on implementation and oversight, I did think it was interesting also that executive order that came out the same day or the day before the bill signing, setting up this implementation task force. And you see Mayor Landrieu from New Orleans going to be heading that task force. I think given his position as a former mayor, he knows what it's like to work in local government. He'll be helping coordinate among the federal agencies, but I also think be that kind of liaison to state and local governments, make sure they have the information that they need. This is an overwhelming amount of new possibilities. And they want to make sure it's a level playing field so that small rural communities have access to those dollars. They know when the grant application opens, they know how to apply. They don't need always, a highfalutin consultant to help them write the grant. I think they're also building in some technical assistance and help so that everybody has access and opportunity with these funds.
Next question for you, Emily, and it's something that I know that Greg DiLoretto, past president of ASCE, when he and I visited back in 2017, I'll never forget it. I was actually in Jonesboro, Arkansas. I had an event at Arkansas State University, go Red Wolves. But anyway, I actually interviewed Greg from a meeting room there in the hotel. And Greg, at that time in 2017, he went through what was then the most recent ASCE report card. And as you know, Emily, because you're such a big part of that report card, but there's so many areas covering infrastructure. And so again, talk about highways, talk about bridges, other things. But as you looked at the bill, do you think areas such as, and I remember Greg mentioning environment, water is a big one, broadband internet, do you feel like those areas are addressed sufficiently in this bill?
It's so funny that you mentioned that. I mean, I love that you're bringing up all the members of the ASCE family, but just talking to Greg DiLoretto this morning about yes. He's still on our report card committee. He is, one of these people volunteers that is retired, but spends a good bit of his time, making sure that our infrastructure report cards live up to the promise and the brand that we've created. So I think we were talking about, the narrative now, and now that we've got this infrastructure bill, and we're continuing to do state and local report cards. Will the public expect that we say, the problem's been solved, or what, for us? And it's I think we need to acknowledge and celebrate, and we are the significance of this moment and this legislation. And when you look through, you can see them on the White House fact sheets, or we've put out some materials. There's so many, first time evers and biggest ever. And it's not hyperbole. It's, the biggest investment in rail, the biggest federal investment in water infrastructure, although we've seen that, that's after decades of declines. So a lot of progress, but at the same time, this isn't going to completely solve our funding gap or investment gap for infrastructure. And we've never said that the federal government is solely responsible for closing that gap. So how do we acknowledge that it's a significant down payment? And particularly you look at water infrastructure, there's $55 billion set aside for water infrastructure. That's much more than has been in the past, but that's not going to cover all of the upgrades to wastewater treatment plants. There's been a lot of talk about lead service lines. And, unfortunately, we keep seeing, Flint, Michigan is not the only example of lead service lines in communities and drinking water quality suffering. So there's a lot of work to do. So $55 billion is going to be a wonderful, arm and way to get us going, but it's not going to solve the entire problem. So a long-winded answer to your question, but I think we're thinking through, what this legislation means. And I think as civil engineers and the whole infrastructure community, how do we ensure, again, that we meet the moment and help, the federal government optimize these funds, uncover unintended consequences if there are any, just because there's so much policy and changes in here. There's bound to be things that, just need some tweaks or haven't, don't work out in implementation exactly the way they wanted to. So we're kind of at the ready and trying to anticipate some of those issues.
Yeah, ambitious and broad in scope. There's little doubt about that. The final thing I have for you, Emily, I imagine we have a great audience when it comes to the podcast version of the Big Bid Theory. And so I assume that our conversation is being watched in boardrooms, in businesses, and maybe more importantly, being watched in living rooms in the United States. So for people watching this video, you mentioned water. You and I have talked about transportation. We've talked about highways and roads. And I think people maybe in some way can connect that yes, this is going to impact and improve my life. But for people watching this, understanding the investment, it's significant. What would you tell people if they were to ask the question, what's in this for me? As I sit in my house, we're in Idaho, California, Rhode Island, wherever, how will this make my life better?
Sure. Great question. And I think it's going to reverberate throughout life in a number of ways. And just to point out a few, in addition to the examples that you made, that were all spot on. If you have broadband outages or you don't always have a great internet connection, it means, not having to drive to the McDonald's parking lot to get a good connection. If you're in Texas, hopefully, we're going to have reliable, redundant sources of electricity and keep those outages to a minimum. As we approach the holiday season, I know I'm, feverishly tracking my Amazon packages. Hopefully this means that we're going to get those goods moving through ports. We're going to have, barges not sitting on those inland waterways. It's just going to be kind of a ripple effect and an overdue investment. I mean, we've always, going back to Greg DiLoretto and Brian and others, talked about it's similar to the roof on your house. And what we have been doing is, we put the roof on 30 years ago and then kind of set it and forget it. And now this is the major house renovation, right? So we're going to make sure we're using the best materials, the best design, the best processes, so that we're, set up for the next 100 or more years, really.
All righty. So a real quick segue here. Again, many thanks to Emily for carving some time out of her busy schedule. Exciting times at ASCE. And so for Emily to take a little bit of time to share her insights, her thoughts with us, we certainly appreciate her so much and our friends over at ASCE. And now real quickly, Stephen Hetzel, Chief Operations Officer and co-founder of BidPrime, based in Austin, Texas. If you go to bidprime.com, you can learn more about BidPrime. This show is powered by BidPrime, so hopefully you folks listening out there are familiar with BidPrime. But Stephen has been around the government purchasing, government contracting industry for well beyond a decade. I don't want to age him, but here's my conversation where Stephen talks about a lot of upcoming initiatives when it comes to the legislation, but more important, or as important as that, towards the end of our discussion, our conversation, Stephen, and talking to vendors and talking to potential contractors out there, really lays out what those businesses, what those companies need to do to be prepared for all the bids, solicitations, RFPs that are right around the corner. Here's my visit with Stephen Hetzel.
Your thoughts as you looked at my conversation, watched and listened to what Emily had to say.
And we've all been saying for a long time that infrastructure is more than just roads and bridges. And I think Emily really nailed that. She mentioned the electrical grid, the ports and waterways. She even mentioned, some of the supply chain issues that come by not having appropriate rail and roads that lead to ports and the waterways. That was, timely mentioned there. Broadband, water systems, et cetera. Also, some interesting notations about resiliency and reconnecting communities. I did some research on our own end to look more into the holistic approach regarding infrastructure that was pretty important with this administration. So we launched something called, just a note, something called Doc Search, this summer. It lets me dig into the text of these documents of all these projects coming out. Ran some of these reports. It was pretty interesting, especially with regards to resilience and pre-mitigation opportunities and things of that nature.
Yeah, so we get a lot of questions about timelines, and everybody watching our conversation, Stephen, everybody understands that a lot of people have been reporting on the infrastructure bill as it made its way through Congress. Of course, when President Biden signed the bill back on November 15th, a lot of reporting has taken place afterwards as well. There's a lot of talk about timelines. What do you have to say about timeframes for the release and impact for contractors and businesses who are watching our conversation out there?
Right. Getting this legislation out, there's a lot of technocratic, bureaucratic details that are not always understood by, people like us or contractors. So it was really interesting to hear Emily note how it was delved out first in formula funds and discretionary grants and how that works. What I found interesting too is that capital improvement projects that may already be set up or past the design phase, a lot of that stuff's already on the books, has been in the works for a while. They were just anticipating, some sort of funding. Maybe they had a funding issue or gap at some point. That's something that could, in Q1 of this year, we could see projects like that already, with boots and shovels on the ground in 2022. So I thought that was interesting to hear about capital improvement projects on that front. And so basically we should see some projects out very soon. And then also a lot more of this planning and technical assistance stuff, which I know we'll get into.
Exactly. And I'm just going to add this point to what you just said. And you're exactly right. Emily's exactly right. But I think there may be some people out there, certainly there are a number of businesses, contractors, vendors who understand that infrastructure has been an ongoing thing here in the United States. But I think some people don't understand how many opportunities are out there currently, as in right now, but even going back months and years ago, it wasn't as though there wasn't anything being done when it comes to infrastructure, but certainly it wasn't being addressed to the level that is required. Now, Emily pointed out that the infrastructure bill tackled more sophisticated aspects related to asset management. What types of projects are along those lines?
Right. And just to go back to your last point, Bill, I mean, this is infrastructures. We've been doing this long enough. It's every day, it's ongoing, but this is infrastructure on steroids, to put it that way.
Yeah.
But going back to the asset management approach, I mean, I thought that was an interesting approach, like what that meant. What is asset management? There are a lot of strings attached to funding, and some of that is with transformation. We've seen a lot of that also in the state and local market over the last decade. And that's, everything from digitizing blueprints, schematics, pipe infrastructure, electrical infrastructure. I pulled some other data that we'll put on the screen right now that should show some of the asset management opportunities that are actually in the public works sector. And this is specifically related to software. So that's a whole other set of industry that's affected by this infrastructure bill. This applies to everything from like locating pipes and utilities to pothole and pavement management, keeping inventory on all the issues that are going on day to day with water leaks, lots of other stuff that's out there. We should see a huge uptick in the public sector with new innovations and with regards to public works in particular in the next couple of years. It'd be interesting to watch.
Yeah, no doubt about that. When I visited with Emily, and again, you folks watching my conversation with Stephen Hetzel from BidPrime right now, you can go to the channel and take a look at my discussion with Emily Feenstra from the American Society of Civil Engineers. But Stephen, I want to ask you this question. There are so many different state, local, federal agencies out there, and I don't know, at least in my experience, if all of them are following the same playbook when it comes to the purchasing process, the requesting process. What do you think contractors need to know about how to keep their eyes out for these project opportunities that are certain to come here in the not too distant future?
Right. When Emily was talking about the process of applying for grants, which, by the way, come out for bids often for infrastructure consultants and technical assistance opportunities. I think we have some more examples there. Just looking, and that's been a long time. There's a lot of history of technical assistance. But what from Emily said, The administration and DOT in particular took a proactive approach on this so that communities are kept in the loop. It's really a ground up effort. It's not like infrastructure could be done just at the federal level. There's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of existing infrastructure, meaning in the public sector, that can facilitate these projects. Excuse me. So, right now it's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of money out there. The loudest voice in the room shouldn't always be able to monopolize all the funding, shouldn't get all the attention. And so it's interesting to note that the DOT has programs that they're implementing right now to roll this out in a more efficient and fair manner. Especially, there's urban areas and rural areas, and the needs of each one of those areas may be a little bit different. But the bulk of this will be carried out by our state and local governments, at least at the actual boots on the ground, selecting contractors, all of that. There are federal strings attached, and that's what, with the holistic stuff that we were talking about, with having certain, smart asset management, smart water management, smart meters, things like that. We're going to see a lot of innovation that will be covered in this funding.
Yeah, I think everybody understands that the federal government, in many aspects, but not all, will be kind of quarterbacking things.
Right.
But the boots on the ground, the shovel in the dirt, that kind of stuff is going to be handled by state and local agencies. Speaking of which, so Stephen, you've been around this industry for a long time, and you know how state, local agencies and the federal side, how they communicate their opportunities. Well, if a contractor is watching this video, if a vendor, if a business owner, what have you, are watching our conversation, what do they need to know as far as staying on top of the opportunities that are coming down the pike very soon?
Right. It's almost impossible to track it yourself. If it is, you have to have 100 people doing it for you. So fortunately, BidPrime has you pretty well covered here. We have the most comprehensive coverage set of opportunities out there. Our real focus, our bread and butter, is on state and municipal government. The public sector as a whole, of course, federal, everything in between. And state and local governments could be everything from school districts, airports, ports, rail, transit authorities, housing authorities, et cetera. It's all over the place. So we actually seek out and track these bids and RFPs from agencies, so you don't have to do them on your own. We match them to you based on a number of criteria, keywords, codes, machine learning, et cetera. And we customize a profile template that's specific to the customer. So, if they want to see a certain segment of something with airports or with ports, we can narrow down to specific opportunities so that our customers have maximum exposure to the most relevant opportunities without the noise. So thus, you don't really have to worry about looking for these future opportunities, since they're very hard to find at the state and local level. The federal government makes it fairly easy to find opportunities on your own. State and local is just not that way. It's just the nature of the United States, the way we're built. It's important to note that these are actually, the way we collect our opportunities. It's from government websites, portals, pre-bid information, cyclical contracts, classified ads, public notices, vendor lists. Just all over the place that we're on top of. And we put you in a really unique position to know about all these opportunities and everything coming out in this infrastructure bill, with especially with our docs on demand. I think that we've talked a lot about docs on demand, where probably the hardest part of doing business with the government is actually getting your eyes on the actual specifications of the bid, much less searching it on your own too. So our access to almost every public document out there gives our customers really a unique sense of options to narrow down the focus of the opportunities and really find specific niches for them. If you're interested in doing government, please take a free trial of BidPrime. Check us out. It's you'll find that we are able to match you to more relevant opportunities from places that you're not going to be able to find on your own.
All right, Stephen. Well, very good. Good elevator plus pitch there. And
sorry, I always do that.
What's that?
Sorry, I always do the BidPrime elevator pitch, but
No, hey, I appreciate it. I know our viewers do as well. Hey, it's your nickel. Again, that's going to do it for part 2 of the conversation surrounding what I said, and I think I'm right. This transformational legislation, the infrastructure bill signed by President Biden. Now it's time for a bunch of folks to get to work. Thanks for joining us. I do want to thank Emily Feenstra again from the American Society of Civil Engineers. Their website, by the way, is ASCE.org. And Stephen, I'm going to put you on the spot. If anybody, you mentioned a free trial, I do believe. If anybody wants more information about BidPrime, what is the website? Or if somebody wants to have a conversation to kind of pick the brains of your folks at BidPrime, what do they need to do?
Sure, it's BIDPRIME.com, BidPrime.com. We have a free trial, so you can sign up for the free trial, test it out on your own. If you have any unique keywords or customizations, we certainly have an avenue to where you can come up with that. We also have an area, I think, on the website. Maybe they can post it on this video, but to request a quote or a demo, if you really just want to just cut right to it and try to find the perfect opportunities for you, sign up for it. But free trial is always a good starting point.
All right. Again, thank you to Stephen Hetzel as well. And Rick, as I look again, I don't want you to get too emotional, but what do you have for us here in this final crazy bids you can win here in season 7?
Hey, if I am emotional, it is not a goodbye, it's a see you later, because we will be back with more crazy bids and more content, of course, for our listeners. But for this episode of the Big Bid Theory for Crazy Bids, I think I picked out a pretty great one to end the season on. This comes all the way from the city of Rutland, Vermont. The title of the bid is Laboratory Testing of Concrete Sidewalk. So I saw the title of this and thought, okay, who's picking up a chunk of sidewalk and putting it under a microscope? That seems a little bit crazy. And that's mostly just where this came from. I just had that imagery in my head and thought it was kind of the funniest thing ever. But basically, the city of Rutland, they're looking for bids from qualified laboratories and their staff to do a little bit of analysis on a concrete sidewalk that was installed, I believe it was just about a year ago, that is already starting to scale and deteriorate. Basically, I guess somebody had installed it not all that long ago, and it's starting to just kind of fade away a little bit quicker than normal, which is also kind of crazy to me in thinking that you can send just a chunk of ground to a laboratory, and they can tell you, yes, this is exactly why it is falling apart, and tell you lots and lots of things about it. That's still crazy to me, but still, it's kind of funnier to think that somebody's just putting a chunk of sidewalk under maybe, I don't know, a giant, I don't know, a spectrometry laser or something like that. I don't know. I'm obviously not a lab technician. So if you are and you have a accredited laboratory facility and staff, then that is this episode's crazy bid that you can win.
Rick, well, a well-earned, well-deserved sabbatical to you here on record, here on the show. Thanks so much for all that you've done to make the magic of season 7 happen, and the crazy bids as we've gone through the 2021 calendar year. The crazy bids have been exceptional. And speaking of exceptional, thanks so much to our exceptional audience out there. We appreciate you tuning into the show, continuing to share the show with your peers, with your co-workers, with your friends, with your family. We so much appreciate it. Everybody who's downloading, following the Big Bid Theory. During the break, during sabbatical, please continue to send us the emails as we get ready for 2022. If you have any ideas on any topics, any guests, please email them my way. My email is bcolhane@bidprime.com. And if you haven't already, please follow us on Twitter. We will continue to roll out content on the Big Bid Theory's Twitter account at the Big Bid Theory. My personal Twitter is contract_hunter. I will be keeping my eyes and ears on what's going on with the infrastructure bill. I had a good week in the nation's capital last week, kind of boots on the ground, figuring out what's going on with the legislation. We put out a report recently about the infrastructure bill as well, and it details a little bit about my trip over to DC. You can also find us on Facebook, so keep an eye on what's going on there. Powered by BidPrime. That's an end to season 7 of the Big Show. Thanks again to Emily Feenstra and Stephen Hetzel for taking part in this final episode of season 7. Thank you to Rick Jennings. Thank you to Emily. Thank you to Tanya. Thank you to Mike. Thank you to everybody here, our team at the show, an exceptional group. This is Bill Culhane for the final time in season 7. Go Gunners, Barracudas, Tigers, Bobcats, and Cubs, and we wish you all the best in growing your business.
Powered by BidPrime, we thank you for tuning in to the Big Bid Theory. From Austin, Texas, the show is produced by Bill Culhane and Jim Ward. Producer and engineer is Rick Jennings. distribution, research, and production assistance by Kevin Henderson. You can find other episodes of the show on platforms such as iHeart, iTunes, Spreaker, Google Play, Stitcher, among others. As always, thank you for downloading and sharing the podcast.
We're having so much fun.